The junkyard stretched farther than the eye could see. It was a sea of broken machines, twisted metal, and old ships brought down from the skies. The air smelled of rust and smoke, and the sun was sinking low, painting the piles of scrap with a dull orange glow. In the middle of it all, Daniel walked slowly, dragging his boots across the dirt, his eyes searching through the heaps as he did every day. He worked here for years, yet every evening felt the same. Some days, he wondered if the metal mountains had no end. Daniel was not a rich man. He lived in a small room near the edge of the yard, working from sunrise to sunset, sorting pieces that could be sold and tossing away what was useless. Most of the time, the wreckage came from Earth itself: burned cars, ruined drones, sometimes even old cargo ships that had been decommissioned. But sometimes, very rarely, the junkyard received alien scrap from the battles above the skies. Daniel always looked forward to those days. He never knew what he might find. This evening, as he wandered further than usual, he noticed something strange. A new shipment had been dumped earlier in the day, but he had not checked it yet. Half buried in the pile was an object that did not look like metal from Earth. It was smooth, silver, and oval, almost like a giant seed. Unlike the sharp edges of other wreckage, this object looked whole, untouched by fire or impact. It gave off a faint glow, a soft light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Daniel stopped in his tracks. He had seen many broken things in his life, but never something like this. He bent down and brushed away the dust. The surface was cold to the touch, yet strangely alive. It made the hair on his arms rise. He tapped it with his wrench, expecting a hollow sound, but instead, it hummed softly in reply. He looked around. The other workers were busy loading scrap into trucks, paying no attention to him. To them, one more piece of alien junk meant nothing. But Daniel felt differently. Something about this object pulled at him. It was as if it was waiting for him. With effort, he dug around the base and freed it from the pile. The object was heavier than it looked, but Daniel managed to roll it onto a cart. As he pushed it toward his shed, he kept glancing back to see if anyone had noticed. Nobody did. The yard was noisy, and the men cared only about their wages. Daniel smirked faintly, feeling like he had stolen something precious without even knowing what it was. By the time the sky turned dark, Daniel had the strange object inside his shed. He closed the door, lit a small lamp, and wiped the sweat from his brow. The silver surface glimmered under the warm light, and he could now see faint lines etched across it, like veins on a leaf. At the center was a panel, shaped like a circle. It looked almost like a lock, though no key could fit it. Daniel sat on his workbench, staring at it. He thought of selling it. Alien tech always had value. Maybe he could get enough to leave this place, enough to start a new life away from rust and dirt. But then, he shook his head. Something told him it was not just another machine. It felt more important, almost alive. Hours passed, and the night grew quiet. The hum of the object filled the shed, steady and soft, like breathing. Daniel could not resist any more. He reached out and placed his hand on the circular panel. At first, nothing happened. Then the surface grew warm under his palm. The lines across the object lit up, glowing brighter and brighter until the shed was bathed in silver light. Daniel gasped and pulled back, but it was too late. The panel clicked, and the object opened with a slow hiss. Cold air spilled out, and mist covered the floor. Daniel stepped closer, his heart pounding. Inside the capsule lay a figure. It was a girl. She looked young, no older than 16 or 17. Her skin was pale, almost shining in the dim light, and her hair was silver, spreading across the cushion like threads of light. Her eyes were closed, and her body was thin, as if she had been asleep for a long time. She wore simple clothing, though unlike anything Daniel had seen before. For a moment, Daniel froze. He had expected wires, gears, maybe an alien machine. But this was a living being. He took a cautious step forward, unsure if she was even alive. Then her chest rose slowly, and he realized she was breathing. Daniel knelt beside her, shaking slightly. "Hey," he whispered, though he doubted she understood his words. Her eyes flickered, and slowly, they opened. They glowed faintly, like the silver of the capsule. She looked around, confused, then focused on Daniel. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the silence heavy. Then she whispered something in a soft, broken voice. The words were strange, but Daniel heard fear in them. She tried to lift her hand, weak and trembling, as if reaching for help. Without thinking, Daniel took it. Her fingers were cold but small, fragile like glass. She held onto him tightly, as if afraid he would let go. Daniel's thoughts spun. Who was she? Why was she here, hidden in the junkyard? Why would anyone throw away a living person? He could not understand it, but one thing was clear: she had been abandoned, locked away to be forgotten. The girl closed her eyes again, but this time she did not fall back into deep sleep. She rested, breathing steadily, her hands still clinging to his. Daniel sat there in silence, watching over her. Outside, the junkyard was still and lifeless, but inside the shed, a new story had begun. Daniel had found something that was never meant to be found. And nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The shed was quiet except for the steady hum of the capsule and the faint sound of the girl's breathing. Daniel sat on his stool, watching her with cautious eyes. His hands were still shaking from the shock of what had just happened. He had opened a capsule, not knowing what lay inside, and instead of a machine, instead of wreckage or alien metal, he had found life. The girl lay weakly on the cushion, her skin pale under the lamplight. Every now and then, her fingers twitched, and her eyes fluttered open for a second before closing again. Daniel could not tell if she was sick or simply exhausted. She had clearly been inside the capsule for a very long time. He reached for a flask of water and hesitated. He did not know if her kind even drank water, but she looked so frail he decided to try. Slowly, he lifted her head with his arm and pressed the flask to her lips. At first, she did not react, but then her lips parted slightly, and she sipped. She coughed softly, then drank again, more steadily this time. Daniel let out a breath of relief. At least she could drink. "You're alive," he whispered, though he knew she could not understand his words. The girl opened her eyes, and for the first time, she focused on him properly. Her eyes glowed faint silver, reflecting the light of the lamp. She blinked as if struggling to see clearly, then whispered something in her strange language. Her voice was soft, trembling like the wind through broken glass. Daniel leaned closer. "I don't know what you're saying," he said gently, "but you're safe here." Of course, she could not understand him, but his tone seemed to calm her. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression a mix of fear and curiosity. Then she closed her eyes again, still breathing steadily. Daniel sat back, running his hand through his hair. His thoughts were a storm. If anyone discovered what he had found, the girl would be taken away. The government claimed to protect alien life, but everyone in the yard knew the truth. If something valuable was found, it was taken, studied, or locked away forever. This girl would not be treated kindly. He looked at her fragile form. Whoever had sealed her inside the capsule had not cared if she lived or died. She had been thrown into space like garbage. That thought burned inside Daniel's chest. No living being deserved such cruelty. Hours passed, and Daniel stayed awake, guarding her like a silent watchman. When the first rays of morning crept through the cracks in the shed walls, the girl stirred again. This time, she pushed herself weakly into a sitting position. Daniel quickly moved to help her, placing a hand behind her back so she would not fall. She was light, far too light, as though she had not eaten in weeks. She looked around the shed, her eyes moving slowly across the tools, the metal parts, and the wooden walls. When she spoke, her words were broken, but Daniel noticed she was trying to form simple sounds. She pointed at the flask and whispered, "Water." Daniel's eyes widened. You know this word." She blinked at him, then repeated, "Water." Her accent was heavy, her voice strained, but the word was clear. Daniel felt a spark of hope. Maybe she could learn. Maybe they could understand each other. He handed her the flask again, and she drank, though her hands trembled as she held it. "What's your name?" Daniel asked softly, pointing at himself. "Daniel." He tapped his chest. "Daniel." She looked at him, puzzled at first. Then she touched her own chest and whispered, "Myra." Daniel froze for a moment, then smiled. "Myra," he repeated. The sound of her name felt strange yet beautiful. She gave a faint nod, as if confirming it. Myra. That was who she was. Not junk. Not worthless. She had a name. The hours that followed were filled with small attempts at communication. Daniel pointed to objects in the shed, speaking their names slowly. Lamp. Table. Chair. Myra tried to repeat, though her words were rough and quiet. Sometimes she shook her head, confused, but Daniel never grew impatient. He encouraged her with gentle nods, and each time she succeeded, a small spark of light appeared in her tired eyes. But alongside the progress, Daniel began to see her scars. Not scars on her skin, but deeper ones. Whenever a loud noise came from outside, the crash of metal, the shout of workers, Myra flinched and curled in on herself, covering her head with her arms. Daniel realized she carried fear, a fear planted in her by whoever had cast her away. That evening, when the sky turned red once more, Myra finally spoke in her own tongue for a longer moment. Daniel could not understand her words, but the sadness in her voice was clear. She placed a hand on her chest, then gestured outward, her eyes filling with tears. Daniel guessed she was telling him her story. Though he could not know the full truth, he understood one thing: her people had abandoned her. They had chosen to throw her away, to lock her in a capsule and leave her drifting in darkness. Daniel's chest tightened. He reached out, not knowing what else to do, and placed a hand gently over hers. "You're safe now," he said. "You're not alone anymore." She looked at him, silent tears sliding down her pale cheeks. For a moment, she seemed uncertain. Then, slowly, she gave a faint nod. That night, Myra fell asleep on the cot Daniel had set up for her. She curled up under a blanket, her breathing even at last. Daniel sat nearby, watching her in the quiet glow of the lamp. He felt a strange weight on his shoulders, but it was not a burden. It was a promise forming deep inside him. He did not know who Myra truly was. He did not know what powers she carried, what past she bore, or what dangers her presence might bring. But he knew one thing with certainty. She had been thrown away, considered worthless by her own people. But to him, she was not worthless. She was alive, and that was enough. For the first time in many years, Daniel felt his life had meaning. And he would not let anyone take Myra away from him. Morning light spilled through the cracks of the shed, falling across the wooden floor and the old metal tools scattered around. Daniel stirred awake in his chair, his back aching from the hard seat. He had stayed up most of the night, keeping watch over Myra as she slept on the cot. When he opened his eyes, he found her already awake, sitting quietly with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was staring at the capsule, which now sat open in the corner like an empty shell. Her silver hair fell over her face, and her glowing eyes were distant, as though trapped in memories. Daniel noticed her hands trembling slightly. He rose slowly, stretching his arms. "Good morning, Myra," he said in a soft voice, unsure if she understood. She looked up at him, blinking, then gave the faintest nod. Daniel poured water into a small cup and handed it to her. She accepted it carefully, her fingers brushing against his. Though her grip was weak, her eyes showed a quiet strength, as if she was trying to keep herself steady. For a long while, silence filled the shed. Then Myra began to speak in her own tongue. The words were soft, broken by pauses, but she did not stop. She touched her chest and then gestured outward, her voice carrying a sorrow Daniel could feel even without knowing the meaning. Daniel watched her closely. He leaned forward, listening, trying to catch familiar sounds. Slowly, Myra repeated one of the words more clearly, pressing her palm against her chest. "Myra." Then she pointed outward, to the capsule, her expression twisting with pain. She whispered another word several times, her eyes wet with tears. Daniel thought carefully. "Throne," he guessed softly, pointing at the capsule. He made a gesture of casting something away. Myra's eyes widened, and she nodded quickly. Then she lowered her head, whispering again in her strange language, the sound filled with grief. Piece by piece, Daniel began to understand. Her people had sealed her inside that capsule. They had thrown her into the void as if she were worthless. She had been left to drift alone until fate carried her to the junkyard. Daniel clenched his fists. The thought made his blood burn. "They abandoned you," he said, anger in his voice though he kept it gentle for her sake. "They thought you were nothing." Myra looked up at him, her silver eyes trembling with unspoken pain. She nodded once, then whispered in broken English, "Worth, less." The word cut into Daniel's chest. He shook his head firmly. "No. Not worthless. Never." Myra blinked at him, confused, as if she did not believe him. She whispered the word again, as though testing it against his. "Worth, less." Daniel leaned forward and placed his hand gently on hers. "No," he said again, his voice steady. "Myra is not worthless. Myra is alive. Myra is strong." Her lips parted, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then, slowly, her shoulders relaxed, though her eyes still carried doubt. The rest of the day passed with quiet attempts at communication. Daniel taught her more words, pointing at simple objects: cup, chair, lamp. Myra repeated them carefully, her accent rough but her determination clear. She learned quickly, her mind sharp despite her weak body. But whenever her gaze drifted back to the capsule, her light dimmed again. At one point, she whispered another word in her own language, repeating it with a look of bitterness. Daniel did not know the translation, but he understood the feeling behind it. It was the word of rejection, the mark her people had placed upon her. In the afternoon, Daniel decided to take Myra outside for fresh air. He draped his old coat over her shoulders and guided her out of the shed. The junkyard stretched before them, mountains of twisted metal glowing in the sunlight. Myra's eyes widened as she took in the sight. She stepped carefully, her bare feet touching the dirt, her hands gripping Daniel's arm for balance. She looked around with wonder, though also with fear. The clang of metal from other workers in the distance made her flinch, but Daniel stayed close, whispering reassurance. He showed her the broken ships and old machines, explaining in simple words. Scrap. Metal. Junk. Myra repeated the words softly, her gaze thoughtful. When they passed a pile of rusted parts, Myra paused. She crouched down, touching a piece of broken metal with her thin fingers. She closed her eyes, and to Daniel's shock, the surface of the metal seemed to glow faintly for a moment. The cracks in it shimmered as though trying to mend themselves. Daniel's breath caught. "You fixed it?" he asked, though the piece crumbled again when she let go. Myra looked up at him with sadness, shaking her head. She whispered in broken English, not strong. Daniel knelt beside her. That's not weakness, he said firmly. That's a gift. Myra's lips curved in the smallest smile, but it faded quickly. She looked out at the endless junkyard and whispered again, worth less. Daniel's chest tightened. He turned to her and placed both hands on her shoulders. Listen to me, he said gently but firmly. You are not worthless. Not here. Not to me. For a long moment, she stared at him, her glowing eyes searching his face. Then she gave the faintest nod, though doubt still lingered in her gaze. As the sun began to set, Daniel led her back to the shed. Myra curled up once more on the cot, silent and thoughtful. Daniel sat at his workbench, staring at the capsule in the corner. His heart ached for her. She had been cast away by those who should have cared for her, thrown aside like scrap. But he knew one thing with certainty. She was not scrap. She was not junk. She was Myra, and she deserved more than what her people had given her. That night, as the stars shone faintly above the yard, Daniel made a silent vow. He would not let her believe she was worthless ever again. He would show her that her life had meaning. And even if the whole world came looking, he would protect her. The days passed quietly in the junkyard, and each day Myra grew stronger. She still looked thin and fragile, but the color had returned to her cheeks, and her steps became steadier. Daniel made sure she had food and water, sharing what little he had, though she never ate much. Sometimes she seemed more interested in the objects around her than in the meals he brought. Myra was curious about everything. She ran her fingers along the walls of the shed, studied the rust on the old tools, and tilted her head whenever she heard a new sound. Daniel tried to explain with simple words, pointing and speaking slowly. She repeated after him, her voice soft but eager to learn. Each day her English grew clearer, though her accent gave her words a gentle rhythm. One morning, Daniel found her crouched near a broken fan that had not worked for years. She touched the bent blades with both hands and closed her eyes. A faint silver glow spread from her fingertips, and for a brief moment, the fan whirred weakly as if trying to come alive again. Startled, Daniel stepped closer. Myra, he said quietly. What are you doing? She opened her eyes and looked at him, her expression unreadable. Fix, she whispered. She tapped the fan gently. Broken. Fix. Daniel knelt beside her, studying the fan. You did this? You made it work. She nodded slowly, though she looked disappointed. Not strong. Only, little. Daniel shook his head in wonder. That's amazing, he said firmly. You have a gift. Myra lowered her gaze. Gift, or curse, she whispered, the sadness in her voice clear even in her broken English. Over the next few days, Daniel noticed more strange things. A dead plant he had left in the corner sprouted new leaves after Myra touched it. A cracked mug she held seemed to seal itself for a short while before falling apart again. Even the air around her felt different, as though it carried a soft energy whenever she was near. At first, Daniel kept these things secret, fearing what others might say. But inside, he felt awe. She was not weak, not worthless. She was special in a way he had never seen before. Still, not everything was peaceful. The other workers at the junkyard had started to notice the faint silver lights at night. One man asked Daniel if he had been running strange machines in his shed. Daniel brushed off the question with a laugh, but inside he worried. If they grew too curious, they might discover Myra. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned purple, Myra and Daniel sat outside the shed. Daniel was teaching her new words. He pointed at the sky. Star. She repeated softly, star. He pointed at the ground. Earth. She tried again, Earth. Myra smiled faintly as she practiced, her silver eyes reflecting the fading light. For a moment, Daniel felt peace, as though the junkyard was no longer just a graveyard of broken things but a place where something new was beginning. Then, suddenly, Myra grew tense. She turned her head sharply toward the gate of the yard. Her eyes narrowed, and she whispered, "Danger." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "Danger," she repeated, pointing toward the entrance. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady. Moments later, Daniel heard it too, the sound of heavy boots on gravel, voices shouting orders, and the roar of an engine. A black truck rolled into the yard, and several men in dark uniforms stepped out. They carried strange equipment, and their eyes scanned the piles of metal with sharp intent. Daniel's stomach dropped. Government agents. He grabbed Myra's hand and pulled her back into the shed. She followed quickly, her face pale but her movements steady. Inside, Daniel whispered, "Stay quiet." He pushed the capsule into the shadows, then guided Myra behind a stack of crates. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the men searched the yard. One of them called out, "Strange readings came from this area. Check every shed." Daniel's heart pounded. He pressed his finger to his lips, signaling Myra to stay silent. She nodded, though her hands shook. The door to the shed creaked open, and light from a flashlight cut across the floor. Daniel held his breath, his body tense. The beam swept across the workbench, the tools, the walls. It stopped for a moment near the corner where the capsule sat half hidden. Daniel's chest tightened, but the man moved on. Then the light flickered, and the man cursed under his breath. His flashlight sputtered, then died completely. He smacked it against his palm, but it refused to turn on. After a frustrated sigh, he muttered, "Faulty gear," and stepped back outside. Daniel turned to Myra, who sat with her hands pressed tightly together, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She had done it. Somehow, she had interfered with the man's tool. When the agents finally left the yard, the sound of their truck fading into the night, Daniel allowed himself to breathe again. He looked at Myra, who was still trembling. "You saved us," he whispered. Myra shook her head. "Not strong," she said again, her voice small. "Only, little help." Daniel smiled faintly. "Little help is enough." That night, Daniel could not sleep. He sat on his stool, watching the glow of the lamp as Myra rested on the cot. He thought about what had happened. Her powers were not just tricks, they were real, powerful, and dangerous if discovered. The government would never let her live freely. To them, she would be a tool, something to study or control. But to him, she was more than that. She was a person who had been thrown away and forgotten, yet she carried something extraordinary inside her. Daniel made a decision. If the world came searching again, he would stand between Myra and anyone who tried to take her. The junkyard was no longer just his workplace. It had become a hiding place, a shield, and perhaps even a home for someone who had never truly known one. And though danger was closer than ever, Daniel felt no regret. He looked at Myra, her silver hair glowing faintly in the lamplight, and thought, "She is not weak. She is not worthless. She is a miracle." The junkyard was never quiet. Metal clanged, sparks flew from cutting torches, and the shouts of workers carried through the air. But in Daniel's shed, the world often felt like a different place. There, time slowed. He and Myra spoke in soft voices, sharing simple lessons. She was learning faster now, stringing short sentences together, asking about words she did not know. "Why, broken?" she asked one morning, pointing to a rusted drone lying on the floor. Daniel smiled. "It's old. Too much damage. It doesn't work anymore." Myra tilted her head and touched the machine carefully. A faint glow lit her fingertips, but the drone did not stir. She pulled her hand back, looking down. Not strong, she whispered. Daniel shook his head. Even trying shows you are strong. Most people would give up. Her lips curved into a small smile. It was still rare, but each time it appeared, it filled Daniel with warmth. For someone who had been thrown away, even the smallest smile was a victory. But peace never lasted long in a place like this. That afternoon, as the sun burned high, the sound of engines echoed across the junkyard. Daniel froze, recognizing it instantly. Trucks. More than one. Heavy and official. His heart sank. He stepped outside the shed and saw them, two black vehicles rolling through the gates, followed by men in dark uniforms. Their boots struck the ground with purpose, and their eyes scanned everything around them. The same men from before had returned. But this time, they had not come quietly. Daniel hurried back into the shed. Myra looked up, sensing his fear at once. "Danger?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Yes," Daniel said quickly. "Danger. We have to hide." He guided her toward the back wall, where stacks of broken crates and scrap metal formed a narrow space. Myra crouched behind them, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her silver eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, filled with worry. Daniel crouched beside her, his heart pounding. The sound of boots grew louder. The shed door burst open, and several men entered. One held a scanning device that beeped rhythmically. He swept it across the room, frowning. "There's something here," the man muttered. "The readings are strong." Another man kicked aside the tools on the floor. "Search everything. Orders are clear. If it's alien, we take it." Myra's body tensed. She clutched Daniel's sleeve, her lips trembling. Daniel whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't move." The men moved closer, their flashlights sweeping across the shed. One beam passed dangerously close to the crates. Daniel held his breath, praying they would not notice. Then, a loud crash outside drew their attention. One of the workers shouted angrily at the agents for breaking a pile of scrap with their truck. The distraction was enough. The men left the shed to deal with the noise, leaving only one behind. The last man muttered as he checked the corners. His scanner beeped louder near the capsule, which still sat hidden in the shadows. He stepped closer, frowning. "What's this?" he said, reaching out. Myra's eyes widened. She whispered in a trembling voice, "No." Before Daniel could stop her, she raised her hand. A shimmer of silver light burst from her fingertips. The man's scanner sparked violently, then exploded in his grip. He cried out in shock, dropping it as smoke filled the shed. The agent spun around, shining his flashlight toward the crates. His eyes locked onto Myra, crouched in fear but glowing faintly in the dark. "There," he shouted. "The alien is here." Daniel reacted without thinking. He leapt forward, slamming into the man and knocking him to the ground. The flashlight rolled across the floor, and the agent groaned, dazed. "Run!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Myra's hand. She stumbled after him as they darted out the back of the shed. The junkyard stretched before them, a maze of metal towers and broken machines. Behind them, the alarmed voices of the agents rose. Boots thundered as they gave chase. Myra clung to Daniel's hand, struggling to keep up with his pace. "Daniel," she gasped, her voice full of fear. "Don't stop," he urged. "We'll lose them in the scrap piles." They weaved between heaps of rusted vehicles, climbed over broken beams, and ducked under dangling wires. Daniel knew the yard better than anyone. Every hidden path and narrow tunnel was etched into his memory from years of work. He led Myra into a tight gap between two collapsed machines, where the shadows swallowed them whole. The agents' voices echoed through the piles. "Spread out. Find them." Daniel crouched low, his arm around Myra as they waited. She was trembling, her silver glow flickering faintly. Daniel whispered, "You're doing great. Just breathe." But the sound of footsteps grew closer. One of the agents appeared on the other side of the pile, scanning the area with a rifle in hand. His eyes narrowed as he spotted movement. "There they are." Daniel cursed under his breath. He pulled Myra to her feet and sprinted again. This time, Myra's fear broke. She turned her head, her eyes blazing silver. She stretched out her hands, and a burst of light erupted. Loose pieces of scrap metal flew from the piles, spinning through the air and crashing down in the path of the agents. The men shouted as they stumbled back, blocked by the sudden avalanche of debris. Daniel looked at Myra in awe, even as they ran. "You did that?" Myra's face was pale, her body weak from the effort. "Not strong," she whispered again. "You're stronger than you think," Daniel said firmly, pulling her onward. They finally reached the far edge of the yard, where the fence was broken and bent. Daniel helped Myra climb through the gap, then followed after her. They stumbled into the shadows of the empty streets beyond, their breaths ragged. Behind them, the shouts of the agents echoed, but the piles of metal slowed their pursuit. When they were far enough away, Daniel guided Myra into an abandoned warehouse nearby. The roof was broken in places, and dust covered the floor, but it offered shelter for the night. Myra collapsed onto a pile of old cloth, her body shaking from exhaustion. Daniel knelt beside her, brushing her silver hair back gently. "You saved us," he said softly. "You were amazing." Myra shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "They want me." "Why?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because they don't see you as a person. To them, you're something to control. A weapon, maybe. But you're not that, Myra. You're you. And I won't let them take you." Her silver eyes filled with tears, but this time she did not argue. She only nodded weakly, resting her head against his arm. As the night deepened, Daniel sat awake, keeping watch. His world had changed forever. The government now knew about Myra. They would not stop hunting her. But no matter what came, Daniel was ready. He would protect her with everything he had. Because in his heart, she was not worthless. She was priceless. The warehouse was quiet except for the faint drip of water from a broken pipe. The night air was cool, and the broken roof let pale moonlight spill inside. Daniel sat with his back against a wall, his arm resting protectively around Myra, who lay beside him. Her breathing was steady now, though her body was weak from the effort she had used earlier. Daniel's eyes remained on the door. He had lived his whole life in the junkyard, surviving on scraps and fixing what others had thrown away. But tonight was different. Tonight he had taken something the government wanted, something they would not stop searching for. He glanced at Myra. She was no longer just something. She was someone. And he would not let them take her. Myra stirred slightly, her silver eyes opening. She whispered, "Safe." Daniel nodded. "For now. But they'll keep looking. We need to be careful." Her eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. "They hunt me, why?" Daniel hesitated, then answered. "Because you're different. You have power. To them, you're not a person. You're something they want to use. But they don't see what I see." She tilted her head, studying him. "What do you see?" Daniel smiled gently. "I see Myra. Not a weapon. Not something broken. Just you." For a moment, silence filled the warehouse. Myra lowered her gaze, her hands resting on her knees. She whispered, "Thrown away, not needed. Worthless." Daniel's voice grew firm. "No. You're not worthless. They threw you away because they didn't understand. But you're here now. And you matter." Myra looked at him, her silver eyes shimmering with a question she did not know how to ask. She did not speak again, but she stayed close to him, as if his words had created a warmth she could not let go of. Morning arrived slowly. The city outside the warehouse stirred with noise, engines, footsteps, and distant shouts. Daniel peeked through a crack in the wall. Men in black uniforms were moving through the streets, showing people strange devices and asking questions. They were searching, just as he had feared. He returned to Myra. "We can't stay here. They're looking everywhere." Myra sat up, her face pale but her spirit steady. "Where, go?" Daniel thought for a long moment. "I know someone. An old friend. He lives in the lower district, hidden away. If anyone can help us, it's him." Myra nodded, trusting his words. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, hiding her glow as best she could. Daniel took her hand, and together they slipped out of the warehouse into the maze of alleys. The city was alive with movement. Vendors shouted from corners, machines rumbled down the streets, and workers hurried past with tired faces. Daniel kept Myra close, guiding her through the crowd. Her wide eyes took in everything: the bright signs, the noise, the rushing people. It was all new to her. At one corner, a patrol of black uniformed men passed by. Myra froze, her grip on Daniel's hand tightening. He whispered quickly, "Don't look at them. Keep walking." She obeyed, though her steps trembled. They moved through the crowd until the patrol was gone. Daniel led her into a narrow stairwell that descended into the shadows of the lower district. Down there, the city changed. The air grew damp, the walls stained with rust and mold. Pipes dripped water into dark puddles, and the lights flickered weakly. People here moved with tired caution, avoiding each other's eyes. "This way," Daniel whispered. They reached a small door hidden between two massive pipes. Daniel knocked 3 times, then waited. After a moment, the door opened, revealing an older man with a thin face and sharp eyes. "Daniel," the man said, surprised. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Daniel replied. "I need help. Please." The man studied him for a moment, then glanced at Myra. His eyes narrowed at her glow, but he stepped aside. "Come in." Inside was a cramped room filled with tools, screens, and wires. Machines hummed quietly, and the air smelled of metal and oil. The man shut the door behind them. "This is Myra," Daniel said carefully. "She's not from here." The old man's sharp eyes softened with curiosity. "I can see that. Alien." He looked at Daniel. "You know what this means, don't you? The government will hunt you both to the ends of the city." Daniel nodded. "That's why I came. I need a place to hide her. Just for now." The man sighed, rubbing his chin. "Daniel, you always get into trouble. But I owe you." "Fine. She can stay here for a short time. But you must leave before they trace you to me." Myra looked between them, not fully understanding, but sensing the tension. She whispered softly, "Safe." Daniel turned to her. "Safe for now." The old man gave her a long look, then muttered, "Strange. They call beings like you dangerous, but I don't see danger. I see fear in your eyes." Myra lowered her head, whispering, "Thrown away." The old man's brows furrowed. He looked at Daniel. "Thrown away." Daniel explained quickly about the capsule, about how she had been cast aside like trash. The man shook his head slowly. "Unbelievable. To waste life like that." The day passed in the shadows of the lower district. Myra sat quietly, watching the screens and blinking lights, asking small questions now and then. Daniel answered patiently, teaching her words, explaining the strange human world she now lived in. But as night returned, trouble found them again. The old man suddenly froze at one of his monitors. "They're sweeping the lower district now. Soldiers." They'll be here soon. Daniel's jaw tightened. We'll leave before they find us. Myra looked up, her silver eyes filled with worry. Always run. Daniel knelt in front of her, meeting her gaze. For now, yes. But we won't run forever. One day, we'll stop. And they won't be able to hurt you anymore. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to believe him but did not know how. Then she nodded slowly, her trust placed in him again. The old man pressed a small device into Daniel's hand. This will block their scanners for a short time. It's not perfect, but it may give you an advantage. Daniel gripped it firmly. Thank you. I owe you. You always owe me, the man muttered, though his eyes softened with concern. That night, Daniel and Myra slipped once more into the maze of the city, moving quickly while patrols closed in. The scanner blocking device hummed faintly, giving them cover for now. Myra walked close beside him, her silver glow hidden under the blanket, her eyes fixed on him with quiet strength. For the first time since she had been thrown away, Myra began to feel something new. Not just fear. Not just weakness. But a sense of belonging. She whispered softly, almost to herself, not alone. Daniel heard her. He looked at her and smiled. No. Not alone. Together, they vanished into the shadows, the hunt far from over but their bond stronger than ever. The city at night was a maze of steel bridges, broken streets, and flickering lights. Daniel and Myra moved quickly, keeping to the narrow alleys where shadows were thick. The small device the old man had given them still hummed in Daniel's pocket, but he knew it would not last forever. When its energy faded, the scanners would find them again. Myra walked close beside him, her blanket wrapped tightly around her small frame. Her silver eyes glowed faintly beneath the hood, catching the light of the lamps. She looked around with both fear and wonder. The world was loud, alive, and confusing to her, yet she stayed near Daniel, trusting him to lead. They crossed a broken bridge above a canal. The water below was black and full of trash. Myra stopped for a moment, staring down at her reflection. The silver glow of her eyes shimmered on the surface. She whispered, "Why do they hate me?" Daniel stopped too, turning to her. His voice was steady. Because you are different. They fear what they don't understand. And when people fear, they want to control or destroy. But not everyone is like that. Her gaze shifted from the water to him. You, not afraid. Daniel gave a small smile. I was, at first. But now I see you. I don't see a monster. I see someone who deserves to live, to be free. Myra's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something more, but before she could, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the streets behind them. Daniel pulled her forward quickly. We have to move. Now. They ran into the narrow alleys. The scanners above buzzed faintly in the sky, their red lights sweeping over rooftops. The device in Daniel's pocket flickered weakly. He knew it was losing strength. Myra's breath quickened as she followed him. She whispered, "They are close." I know, Daniel said. We need to reach the rail tunnels. Once we're underground, it'll be harder for them to track us. But the soldiers were faster this time. As they turned a corner, Daniel saw black uniforms waiting ahead. Their helmets glowed with red lenses, and their weapons were raised. Daniel froze, his mind racing. There was no clear path. Behind them, more boots echoed closer. They were surrounded. Myra stepped beside him, her silver eyes fixed on the soldiers. She whispered, "They want to take me." Daniel gritted his teeth. "They'll have to go through me first." The soldiers advanced, their voices sharp. "Surrender the asset. No harm will come if you comply." Daniel's hand clenched into a fist. He had no weapon, no shield, only his determination. But before he could act, Myra lifted her head. For the first time, she did not look afraid. Her eyes burned brighter, silver light glowing against the night. The soldiers hesitated, unsure. Their scanners beeped wildly, unable to read her. Myra raised her hand slowly, her voice soft but clear. No more running. Daniel turned to her in shock. Myra, a wave of silver light burst from her palm, spreading across the alley like a silent storm. It swept through the soldiers, knocking them back as if they were weightless. Their weapons sparked, their helmets cracked, and they fell to the ground, groaning in confusion. The alley fell silent. Only the faint hum of Myra's glow remained. She stood still, her hand trembling, her eyes wide with surprise at what she had done. Daniel stared at her. "Myra, you saved us." Her voice shook. I did not mean to. It just happened." Daniel stepped closer, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "That power, it's part of you. You don't have to be afraid of it. You can use it to protect, not destroy." She looked at him with uncertain eyes. "Protect?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Protect yourself. Protect the ones you care about." Her eyes softened. She whispered, "You." Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest at her words. "If you choose to." Before they could say more, the sound of distant alarms filled the night. The soldiers who had fallen were still alive, and reinforcements would come soon. Daniel grabbed Myra's hand. "We have to move, now." They ran again, darting through the dark streets. Myra's glow was dimmer now, as if the burst of power had drained her strength. She leaned against Daniel as they moved, but she did not complain. At last, they reached an abandoned rail tunnel. Daniel helped her climb down into the darkness. The tunnel smelled of dust and rusted metal, but it was hidden from the eyes above. They found an old train car at the far end, half buried in rubble. Daniel pushed open the door, guiding Myra inside. The space was small, but it was shelter. They sat together on the cold floor, their breaths heavy from running. Myra leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "I was afraid," she whispered. "But when I saw them hurt you, something inside me burned. I wanted to stop them." Daniel nodded. "That's what power should be. Not for control, not for hate. For protecting what matters." She closed her eyes, whispering, "You matter." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he said softly, "So do you." The tunnel outside was quiet, but the hunt was not over. Daniel knew the government would not stop. They had seen her power now. They would call her dangerous, even more than before. But as he looked at Myra, her silver glow faintly lighting the train car, he also knew something else. She was not weak anymore. She was learning. She was awakening. And she was not alone. Myra whispered before sleep claimed her, "Not thrown away. Not worthless." Daniel smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "Never worthless." The night passed slowly in the dark tunnel. For the first time, Myra dreamed not of fear, but of light. When morning came, Daniel was ready. He had no clear plan, no safe place yet, but he had hope. And hope, he realized, was more powerful than fear. Together, they would find a way.